February 27th, 1943, 11:47 p.m. The Mona River Gorge, Telemark, Norway. Joachim Renneberg's breath crystallized in the -20 air. He stared down at the industrial fortress carved into the mountain face below. The Vemork hydroelectric plant hummed with electrical current. Its turbines were fed by the 350-foot waterfall that thundered even through the winter freeze. German sentries moving along the suspension bridge, the only way in, they believed. The guards stamped their feet against the cold, unaware that 6 men had already found another route. Renneberg pressed his stomach harder against the frozen granite, feeling the explosive charges shift in his pack. 60 pounds of British plastic explosives, fuses, and detonators, enough to change the course of a war, though at this moment it felt like nothing more than dead weight against his spine. Below him, in the basement of that fortress, sat 18 heavy water cells, each one containing the deuterium oxide that German physicists needed for their atomic experiments. The irony wasn't lost on him. Water, the most common substance on Earth, refined into something so rare it might unlock the power of the sun itself. What none of the guards realized, what even Renneberg couldn't fully grasp as he prepared to descend, was that they were about to witness the most consequential act of industrial sabotage in human history. Not because of what they would destroy, but because of what that destruction would prevent. This is the story of how 6 men with British training and Norwegian blood turned water into fire, and in doing so, rewrote the trajectory of atomic science. The mission had been born from failure. 4 months earlier, in November 1942, Operation Freshman had ended in catastrophe. 2 Halifax bombers towing Horsa-gliders full of British Commandos had attempted the same target. One crashed into a mountain, killing all aboard instantly. The other crash-landed miles from the objective, its survivors captured, interrogated, and executed under Hitler's commando order. 41 men dead, and Vemork still produced its 200 kilograms of heavy water per month. Each shipment moving south toward German laboratories, where Werner Heisenberg and his team worked to unlock atomic fission. The Norwegian resistance had watched Freshmen fail from their mountain hideouts, learning what the British hadn't understood. You couldn't assault Vemork like a conventional target. The plant sat on a shelf of rock 600 feet above the river valley, connected to the outside world by a single suspension bridge rigged with explosives. Machine gun nests covered every approach. Searchlights swept the gorge. The Germans had stationed 30 guards inside the plant itself, with a garrison of 200 more in nearby Jukon. Any direct assault would trigger the bridge charges, trapping attackers in a kill zone with no escape. But the Norwegians knew something else, something that came from growing up in these mountains, from hunting reindeer across these valleys since childhood. They knew that the Germans, like the British, thought in terms of roads and bridges, of conventional movement, across engineered terrain. They didn't think like men who had learned to ski before they could properly walk, who could navigate by the shape of snowdrifts and the sound of wind through pine forests. Renneberg had been 23 years old when Norway fell in 1940. He'd escaped to Britain, joined the Norwegian Independent Company No. 1, and spent 2 years training in the Scottish Highlands for exactly this moment. Beside him on the ridge lay Knut Haukelid, Frederick Kaiser, Casper Idland, Hans Storhog, and Birger Stromsheim, each one selected not just for their combat skills, but for their ability to survive in the Norwegian winter, to move through this landscape like ghosts. They had parachuted onto the Hardingervidda Plateau 5 days ago, dropping through clouds so thick they couldn't see the ground until they were almost upon it. The frozen plateau stretched for 3,500 square miles of desolate wilderness, where temperatures reached 40 below and winds could kill an exposed man in hours. They'd linked up with Gunnar Sonsteby's advance team, men who had been living in hunting cabins since October, preparing the way, gathering intelligence, surviving on reindeer moss and melted snow. Now, as midnight approached, they prepared for the descent into the gorge. The industrial symphony of Vemork rose from below the turbine roar, The electrical hum of the electrolysis chambers where ordinary water was slowly, methodically transformed into something that shouldn't exist in nature. Heavy water, deuterium oxide. 1 neutron's difference between sustaining life and enabling unprecedented destruction. The Germans called it SH-200, their code name for the substance they believed would give them atomic superiority. In laboratories across the Reich, scientists waited for these shipments, each batch bringing them closer to a controlled chain reaction. They were perhaps 2 years away, maybe less, from a functional reactor. After that, the path to a bomb was merely engineering. Runneberg checked his watch. They had 4 hours until the guard change at 4 a.m. 4 hours to descend the gorge, infiltrate the plant, place the charges, and escape before anyone noticed. The margin for error was 0. The descent began at midnight. 6 men, each carrying 60 pounds of equipment, began picking their way down a gorge wall that even experienced mountaineers wouldn't attempt in daylight. The rock face, slick with ice, dropped nearly vertical for 200 feet before offering any kind of ledge. Renneberg went first, his fingers already numb inside his mittens as he felt for handholds that might or might not support a man's weight. Below them, the Mona River had frozen into a ribbon of black ice, invisible in the darkness except where moonlight caught its surface through breaks in the clouds. 1 slip meant a fall that would alert every guard in the valley if it didn't kill the falling man first. They moved in absolute silence, communicating through tugs on the rope that connected them. Even their breathing was controlled, measured, suppressed into tiny puffs of vapor that dissipated before anyone could spot them from above. Halfway down, Berger Stromsheim's boot dislodged a sheet of ice. It fell, shattering on the rocks below, with a sound like breaking glass. All 6 men froze, pressing themselves against the cliff face, waiting for searchlights, for shouts, for the crack of rifle fire. Nothing. The roar of the waterfall had swallowed the sound. They continued down. At the bottom of the gorge, Runneberg hand-signaled the team to rest for exactly 2 minutes, no more, no less. Their bodies were already beginning to stiffen from the cold and exertion. Any longer and their muscles would cramp. He studied the industrial monster looming above them through his binoculars, noting every detail he'd memorized from the blueprints smuggled out by Einar Skinnerland, the plant's inside man who had been feeding intelligence to London for months. The Vemork plant was a masterpiece of industrial engineering, built by Norsk Hydro in 1934 to produce fertilizer. Its turbines, driven by the waterfall, generated 60 megawatts of power, enough to run a small city. But the Germans had discovered another use for all that electricity. In the basement, in a room marked only as high concentration installation, sat the heavy water electrolysis chambers. Here, electrical current split water molecules, separating hydrogen from oxygen, but 1 in every 6,400 water molecules contained deuterium-heavy hydrogen. Through a process of cascading electrolysis, repeated thousands of times, they could concentrate this heavy water to 99.5% purity. The physics were elegant in their simplicity, horrifying in their implications. Heavy water slowed neutrons without absorbing them, making it the perfect moderator for a nuclear reactor. With enough heavy water, you could sustain a chain reaction using natural uranium. No need for the complex enrichment processes the Americans were pursuing in their Manhattan Project. It was the shortcut to atomic power, and Vemork was the only facility in Europe capable of producing it in industrial quantities. Knut Haukelid touched Runneberg's shoulder, pointed up the slope toward the railway line that carried the pipeline up from the gorge. They had identified it weeks ago from aerial photographs, a maintenance track that ran along the water conduits, unguarded because the Germans considered it impossible to climb in winter. The ascent would take them up 600 feet of near-vertical terrain, but it would bring them to the back of the plant, away from the machine gun nests covering the bridge approach. They began to climb again, this time ascending toward their target. The pipeline was coated in ice, each handhold a gamble between grip and catastrophe. Hans Storhog's hands began to bleed through his mittens, the rough ice tearing skin already damaged by weeks of living rough in the mountains. He said nothing, just wrapped strips of cloth torn from his undershirt around his palms and kept climbing. As they climbed, Runeberg thought about Werner Heisenberg, the German physicist whose calculations had convinced the Nazi leadership that heavy water was the key to atomic weapons. Heisenberg had visited Norway in 1942, had stood in this very plant, had run his hands along the electrolysis chambers like a man caressing gold. The Norwegian workers had watched him, memorizing every word, every gesture, reporting back to the resistance. 2 years, Heisenberg had said. With uninterrupted production, 2 years until we have a working reactor. That was 11 months ago. They reached the railway cutting at 2:30 a.m. Through the fence, they could see the massive building housing the electrolysis chambers, its windows darkened for the blackout. 2 guards patrolled the exterior, their routes predictable, synchronized to meet at the main door every 15 minutes. Between those meetings, there would be a window, perhaps 90 seconds, where the back entrance would be unobserved. Frederick Kaiser produced the bolt cutters, specially treated to prevent the metal from squealing when cut. Each snip had been practiced hundreds of times in Scotland, the technique refined until they could cut through chain link in absolute silence. The fence parted like a curtain. They were inside the perimeter. Now came the most dangerous part. They had to cross 40 meters of open ground, snow-covered and moon-bright, to reach the cable duct that Skinnerland had identified as their entry point. If a guard looked out a window, if someone stepped outside for a cigarette, if a searchlight swept the wrong direction, it would all be over. Runeberg watched the guards complete another circuit. As they turned the corner toward the main entrance, he gave the signal. 6 men sprinted across the killing ground, their white camouflage suits making them almost invisible against the snow, almost, but not quite. They reached the cable duct as the guards were meeting at the front door, beginning their ritual exchange of cigarettes and complaints about the cold. The duct was barely 2 feet wide, designed for electrical cables, not human bodies. They would have to remove their packs, push them ahead, crawl through one at a time. If someone got stuck, if the guards changed their pattern, if any one of 1,000 things went wrong, they would be trapped like rats in a pipe. Joachim Runeberg went first, pushing his explosive charges ahead of him into the darkness. Behind him, he could hear his men following, their breathing controlled despite the claustrophobia, despite the weight of what they were about to do. They were crawling into the heart of Nazi Germany's atomic ambitions, armed with nothing but explosives and the absolute certainty that failure meant not just their deaths, but potentially millions more. The duct opened into a basement corridor. They were inside Vemork. The heavy water cells were just 1 floor below. The basement corridor stretched before them like a throat, lit only by emergency bulbs that cast everything in submarine yellow. Runeberg could hear the heavy water cells now, a low, electrical humming that seemed to come from the building's bones. The sound of atoms being split, reformed, concentrated into something unnatural. They moved in single file, weapons drawn but hoping not to use them. Gunfire would bring the entire garrison down on them. At the door marked, "No admittance without authorization," they stopped. Kaiser produced the skeleton keys, cast from wax impressions that Skinnerland had made months ago, smuggled out in a toothpaste tube. The lock turned with a soft click that sounded like thunder in the silence. They pushed through into the high-concentration room. The sight that greeted them was both mundane and apocalyptic. 18 stainless steel cylinders, each one 9 feet tall, arranged in neat rows like industrial soldiers. These were the heavy water concentration cells, their surfaces beaded with condensation from the temperature differential. Pipes and electrical cables ran between them in a complex web, the entire apparatus humming with 12,000 volts of current. At the base of each cell, taps allowed the precious heavy water to be drained into 5-liter steel flasks. On the shelves along the wall, Runeberg counted them nearly 600 kilograms of heavy water, ready for shipment to Germany. Then they heard footsteps. A man appeared in the doorway, not a guard but a Norwegian, a night shift worker in overalls stained with chemical burns. He stared at the 6 commandos, his mouth opening to scream. Hauklid moved faster, clamping a hand over the man's mouth, dragging him inside. The worker's eyes were wide with terror above Hauklid's grip. "We're Norwegian," Renneberg whispered in their native tongue. "British uniforms, but we're Norwegian. You understand? We're here to destroy the heavy water." The man, Gustav Johansen, though they wouldn't learn his name until after the war, nodded frantically when Hauklid released him. He didn't scream. Instead, he whispered, "The Germans. They have 2 guards in the turbine room next door. They check this room every hour." "When was the last check?" 20 minutes ago. 40 minutes to work." Renneberg began unpacking the charges while the others secured the doors. The plastic explosives were British-made, specially designed for this mission-shaped charges that would direct the blast inward, destroying the cells without bringing down the building. They couldn't afford to kill Norwegian workers on the upper floors. As Renneberg worked, molding the plastic explosive against the base of each cell, Johansen watched with a mixture of fear and fascination. "Do you know what this is?" he finally asked. "The heavy water?" "We know," Stromsheim replied, keeping watch at the door. "They tell us it's for synthetic rubber production. But the scientists who come from Berlin, they don't act like men interested in rubber. They act like men holding the future." Runneberg's hands never stopped moving as he replied. "That's why we're here, to make sure their future never arrives." The charges were connected with Cortex, a detonating cord that would ensure all 18 cells blew simultaneously. But Runneberg had a problem. The British scientists had calculated the explosive requirements based on destroying the cells themselves. But looking at the industrial piping above, he realized that even if they destroyed every cell, the Germans could rebuild. The pipes, the infrastructure, it would all remain. He made a decision that wasn't in the mission parameters. Taking extra charges meant for their escape route, he began placing them on the critical joints in the piping system, the master valves that controlled flow between the cascading concentration stages. Without these specific components, which would have to be custom manufactured in Germany, the plant would be crippled for months, maybe a year. 3 minutes, Hauklid warned. Runneberg attached the fuses 2 separate systems for redundancy. British-made time pencils, designed to give them exactly 7 minutes, and a backup system of slow-burning fuse cord that would detonate in 30. If one failed, the other would complete the mission. He armed both systems at 3:45 a.m. "We leave everything as we found it," he ordered. "Doors closed, lights off. Let them sleep until it's too late." They filed out through the same cable duct, Johansen watching them go. At the last moment, Runneberg turned back to him. "When the explosions come, you were in the toilet. You heard nothing until the blast. Understand?" Johansen nodded. They would never meet again, but after the war, Johansen would name his first son Joachim. The retreat was a masterpiece of controlled panic. They had 7 minutes to get clear of the blast zone, but they couldn't run, not yet. The guards were still patrolling, still unaware. They crept back through the hole in the fence, Kaser carefully bending the chain link back into position, making it appear intact from a distance. They descended the railway track. Each step measured against the countdown running in their heads. 5 minutes. They reached the bottom of the gorge. 4 minutes. They began climbing the opposite wall, hands bleeding, lungs burning from the effort. 3 minutes. Halfway up. Below them, Vemork slept, its lights still twinkling peacefully in the darkness. 2 minutes. They could see their ski equipment hidden in the trees above. 1 minute. Runneberg turned to look back at the plant one last time. In the basement, he knew the acid in the time pencils was eating through the copper wire that held back the firing pins. At exactly 3:52 a.m., though, the explosion wouldn't be heard in the guard barracks until 4:30 the charges detonated. The sound wasn't what they expected. Not a massive explosion, but a muffled crump, like a giant fist punching concrete. Through the windows of the high concentration room, they saw a brief orange flash. Then came the secondary sounds, the shriek of tearing metal, the crash of collapsed piping, the hiss of pressurized water escaping into rooms never meant to be flooded. Inside the plant, the destruction was absolute. The 18 cells had been split open like eggs, their precious contents mixing with the cooling water and washing into the drainage system. 500 kilograms of heavy water, representing months of production, diluted in seconds to uselessness. The piping Renneberg had targeted with his extra charges had collapsed, crushing the delicate instrumentation needed to monitor the concentration process. The control panels were scattered across the floor in pieces smaller than a child's fist. But from outside, Vemork looked almost untouched. A few windows broken, some steam rising from the ventilation shafts. The guards who finally responded to the alarm found the doors still locked. No sign of forced entry, except for a British Tommy gun left deliberately behind Renneberg's calling card to ensure the Germans wouldn't blame local Norwegians. The Commandos were already 2 miles away, climbing toward the Hardangervidda Plateau on skis, when they heard the air raid sirens begin to wail in Yukon. Behind them, searchlights swept the valley like the fingers of a blind giant, finding nothing but snow and shadow. The German garrison commander, frantically telephoning Berlin, had to report the impossible. Somehow, someone had destroyed the heavy water program without anyone seeing them arrive or leave. The 6 men didn't stop to celebrate. They had 280 miles of frozen wilderness to cross to reach the Swedish border, with every German soldier in Norway soon to be hunting them. What they had just accomplished, the complete destruction of Nazi Germany's heavy water production, wouldn't be confirmed for weeks. But Renneberg knew, as he pushed through the snow under a canopy of stars, that they had just altered history with 44 pounds of plastic explosive and the will to use it. In Berlin, when the news arrived, Heinrich Himmler himself would rage about ghost soldiers who struck and vanished like winter wind. But the ghosts were already gone, dispersed into the Norwegian landscape they knew better than any map could teach. The storm hit them on the 3rd day. Renneberg had been navigating by compass and instinct across the Hardangervidda when the weather closed in like a fist. Visibility dropped to 10 feet. The temperature plummeted to -30. They were skiing across the largest mountain plateau in Europe, where even experienced hunters could vanish without a trace, and now nature itself seemed determined to claim what German bullets hadn't. They dug a snow cave in the lee of a rocky outcrop. 6 men pressed together for warmth, sharing the last of their pemmican, a concentrated mixture of fat and protein that tasted like candle wax, but could keep a man alive in conditions that would kill him otherwise. Outside, the wind screamed at frequencies that hurt to hear. Inside, they listened to radio broadcasts on their small receiver, trying to learn if their mission had succeeded or if Vemork was already back in production. The BBC said nothing. Radio Berlin said nothing. For all they knew, the Germans had simply cleaned up the mess and resumed production within hours. What they couldn't know, huddled in their snow cave, was that at that very moment, General Nikolaus von Falkenhorst, commander of German forces in Norway, was standing in the wreckage of the high concentration room, trying to comprehend what he was seeing. The precision of the destruction astonished him. Every single heavy water cell had been destroyed, but the structural damage was minimal. The Norwegian workers on the upper floors had slept through the explosion. This wasn't random sabotage, this was surgical, executed by people who understood exactly what they were targeting and why. Kurt Diebner, one of Germany's leading nuclear physicists, had been flown in from Berlin to assess the damage. His report would later be captured by Allied intelligence. The saboteurs possessed intimate knowledge of the cascade process. They targeted not just the cells, but the specific valves and monitoring equipment that cannot be easily replaced. Reconstruction will require components that must be manufactured in Germany under current bombardment conditions. Minimum recovery time, 8 to 10 months. 10 months. In the race for atomic weapons, 10 months might as well be 10 years. The German response was swift and brutal. The Gestapo arrested dozens of Norwegian workers, though they found no evidence linking any of them to the sabotage. They instituted new security measures, double guards, electrified fences, continuous patrols with dogs. They even considered moving the entire operation to Germany, but the energy requirements made it impossible. Heavy water production needed massive amounts of electricity, and Vemork's turbines were irreplaceable. Instead, they chose to rebuild. Engineers were brought from Berlin. New cells were ordered from I.G. Farben. By November 1943, 9 months after the raid, Vemork was producing heavy water again, though at only 60% of previous capacity. The Germans had managed to salvage some equipment, had improvised solutions, had thrown resources at the problem with the desperation of men who knew they were losing the race. But the Commandos had given Allied intelligence something precious: time. Time to plan the next phase. Time to position assets. Time to turn German paranoia into a weapon against itself. Meanwhile, Runneberg's team had split up after 5 days on the plateau. It was safer to travel in smaller groups, less visible, less likely to all be captured if something went wrong. Runneberg and Strömsheim headed for the Swedish border on a route that would take them through occupied territory, crawling with German patrols. The others dispersed in different directions, some to rejoin the resistance, others to safe houses in Oslo. Haukelid chose to stay. Unlike the others, he melted back into the Norwegian resistance, knowing that Vemork would eventually restart production, knowing that the job wasn't finished. He spent the next year living like a ghost in the mountains above Drukon, watching German movements, recruiting local resistance members, preparing for what he suspected would be a final confrontation. His intuition proved correct. By February 1944, Allied intelligence confirmed that the Germans had decided to abandon heavy water production at Vemork entirely. The facility had been bombed by American B-17 seconds in November 1943, and raid that killed 21 Norwegian civilians, but barely scratched the heavy water apparatus deep in the basement. But the psychological effect on the Germans was profound. They no longer believed they could protect Vemork. Instead, they would transport all existing heavy water stocks nearly 14 tons to Germany for safekeeping. The convoy route was meticulously planned by German logistics officers. The heavy water, stored in 39 drums marked potash lye to disguise their contents, would be loaded onto railway cars at Vemork, transported to Lake Tinzio, then ferried across the lake on the D.F. Hydro, a rail ferry that had been making the same crossing twice a day since 1914. From there, trains would carry the cargo to Hamburg, then on to laboratories in Berlin and Munich. Knut Haukelid learned of the plan from a Norwegian railway worker on the 16th of February 1944. The shipment would move in 4 days. He had less than 100 hours to stop 14 tons of heavy water from reaching German atomic scientists. The options were limited and terrible. Attack the railway? Impossible with the forces available, and it would result in massive Norwegian casualties. Sabotage the drums at Vemork? The Germans had triple guards now, checking everyone who came within 50 meters of the storage area. That left only one option: sink the ferry. The hydro carried not just cargo, but passengers, Norwegian civilians commuting across the lake. On any given crossing, there might be 100 innocent people aboard. Haukelid spent 2 sleepless nights wrestling with the mathematics of necessity. How many would die to prevent the possibility of a German atomic bomb? What was the exchange rate between certain deaths now and potential deaths later? On the night of February 19, Haukelid and 3 resistance members snuck aboard the hydro while it was docked. They placed 8 kilograms of plastic explosive in the bilge, positioned to blow a hole below the waterline, when the ferry reached the deepest part of the lake, where the water was 1,300 feet deep. Too deep for any salvage operation. The timer was set for 10:45 a.m. when the ferry would be furthest from shore. Haukelid's hands shook as he set the timer, not from fear, but from the weight of what he was doing. He was no longer a soldier attacking a military target. He was becoming something else, someone who could calculate innocent deaths as acceptable losses. The transformation felt like losing a part of his soul, but he set the timer anyway. The next morning, The 20th of February 1944, the Hydro departed on schedule at 10 a.m. The heavy water drums had been loaded into railway wagons on the vehicle deck. Also aboard were 53 passengers, including women and children heading to church services in Yukon. At 10:45 a.m., the explosives detonated. The blast tore a hole 6 feet wide in the hull. Water rushed in at thousands of gallons per minute. The ferry listed immediately, tilting toward its wounded side. In the vehicle deck, the railway wagons began to slide. The drums of heavy water, each weighing nearly 400 pounds, broke free from their restraints. The ferry took exactly 4 minutes to sink. Most passengers made it to lifeboats or were pulled from the water by local fishermen who rushed to help. But 18 Norwegians drowned in Lake Tinjo that morning, along with 4 German guards. The heavy water drums, all 14 tons of them, plummeted to the lake bottom, where they remain to this day, 1,300 feet down in water, so cold and dark that even modern salvage would be nearly impossible. In Berlin, when news of the sinking reached the nuclear research facilities, Werner Heisenberg reportedly sat in silence for a full hour. Without heavy water, the German reactor program was effectively dead. They could pursue graphite moderation, like the Americans, but that would require starting over, redesigning everything. They were now at least 2 years behind the Manhattan Project, probably more. The mathematics were clear. 6 commandos and a handful of resistance fighters had traded 18 innocent lives to delay German nuclear research by years. It was arithmetic, written in blood and ice, but it was arithmetic that would help ensure Nazi Germany never developed atomic weapons. March 1945. Los Alamos, New Mexico. Klaus Fuchs, the German-born physicist working on the Manhattan Project, read the captured German documents with growing astonishment. The Nazi atomic program, which Allied intelligence had feared was perhaps months from success, had never come close. Their best estimate put German nuclear research in 1945, roughly where American research had been in 1942. The heavy water shortage hadn't just delayed them, it had fundamentally crippled their entire approach to nuclear fission. Joachim Renneberg learned about Hiroshima from a newspaper in Oslo, where he was helping to process German prisoners of war after liberation. The headline spoke of a new type of bomb, one that drew its power from the atom itself. He sat on the steps of the former Gestapo headquarters, now flying the Norwegian flag, and tried to reconcile what he was reading with what he had done 2 years earlier. The Americans had succeeded where Germany had failed. The atomic age had arrived anyway, just under a different flag. "We didn't stop the bomb," he would tell an interviewer decades later. "We just chose who would build it first." Knut Haukelid never fully recovered from sinking the Hydro. After the war, he met with the families of some of the 18 Norwegians who had drowned. One woman, whose husband had been traveling to Yukon for work, asked him if it had been worth it. Haukelid couldn't answer. How do you weigh 18 real deaths against theoretical millions? How do you explain that her husband died to prevent something that might never have happened anyway? The truth, which would only emerge through captured documents and post-war interrogations, was more complex than anyone had imagined during the war. The German atomic program had been riddled with problems beyond just the heavy water shortage. Hitler himself had been skeptical of nuclear weapons, preferring to invest in rockets and jet aircraft weapons he could understand. The German scientists had made critical miscalculations about critical mass. They had pursued reactor design when they should have focused on enrichment. They had been, in many ways, doomed from the start. But none of that was known in 1943. What Renneberg and his team knew was that Germany was trying to build an atomic bomb, that heavy water was essential to their approach, and that Vemork was their only source. They acted on that knowledge with a precision and courage that still astonishes military historians. The entire Gunnerside operation from parachute drop to escape had resulted in 0 Allied casualties while completely destroying the target. It remains perhaps the most successful special operations mission of the Second World War. Werner Heisenberg, interviewed after the war, was asked about the moment he learned of the Vemork sabotage. "I knew immediately that we had lost," he said. "Not just the heavy water, but the race itself. If the Allies could reach into Norway, into our most protected facilities, and destroy them without losing a single man, then they had capabilities we couldn't match. The physical destruction was secondary. The psychological impact was total." The members of Operation Gunnerside returned to different lives after the war. Renneberg became an executive in Norwegian broadcasting, rarely speaking about his wartime service until decades later. Haukelid wrote a memoir, then largely withdrew from public life, haunted by the faces of the hydro victims. The others melted back into Norwegian society: engineers, teachers, businessmen who had once been saboteurs. But history wouldn't let them remain anonymous. As the full scope of what they had prevented became clear through declassified documents, their story grew from a footnote to a legend. Military academies began teaching Gunnerside as the perfect special operations mission. Scientists calculated that the heavy water delays had set back German nuclear research by at least 18 months, possibly the 18 months that made the difference between a Nazi bomb and Allied victory. The final irony came in 1965, when Norsk Hydro resumed heavy water production at Vemork for peaceful nuclear reactors. Renneberg was invited to the reopening ceremony. He stood in the same room he had destroyed 22 years earlier, watching Norwegian technicians operate new electrolysis cells, producing the same deuterium oxide that had once been the substance of nightmares. But now it would fuel research reactors, power plants, medical isotope production, the peaceful applications that had always been possible but had been overshadowed by war. In 2015, at age 96, Renneberg was asked by a young journalist if he had any regrets about Operation Gunnerside. He thought for a long moment before answering, "My only regret is that such operations are necessary, that humans must sometimes destroy to preserve. We didn't know we were preventing a German atomic bomb. We only knew we were doing what needed to be done. The heavy water was a target. We destroyed it. That it changed history. That was for others to decide." The Vemork plant still stands today, converted into a museum. Visitors can walk through the same rooms where heavy water was produced, where commandos placed their charges, where the course of atomic history was altered by plastic explosives and human will. In the basement, a plaque marks the spot where Operation Gunnerside succeeded. It reads simply, "Here on the 28th of February, 1943, Norwegian saboteurs destroyed the heavy water production, preventing Nazi Germany from developing atomic weapons." But perhaps the most fitting memorial is Lake Tinsjo itself. Somewhere in its depths, under 1,300 feet of black water, lie 39 drums containing 14 tons of heavy water, the closest Nazi Germany ever came to atomic capability. They remain there still, a reminder that sometimes the most profound victories are measured not in what we create, but in what we prevent from being created. The 6 men of Operation Gunnerside had parachuted into occupied Norway, believing they were attacking a chemical plant. They emerged from that frozen wilderness having written one of the most consequential chapters in human history. With explosives and expertise, with sacrifice and silence, they had ensured that the power of the atom would not serve the cause of fascism. They couldn't stop the atomic age from arriving, no one could, but they helped determine who would control it when it did. In the end, they discovered what every saboteur learns: destruction, precisely applied, can be an act of preservation. They destroyed 18 cells to preserve millions of lives. They sank a ferry to keep the worst weapons from the worst hands. They proved that in the calculus of war, sometimes the most important battles are won not with armies but with 6 men, properly trained, at the right place, at the right moment, with the will to change history. The atomic bomb would still be built. Cities would still burn. The nuclear age would still dawn with all its terrible possibilities, but it would not dawn under a swastika. For that, the world owes a debt to 6 Norwegian Commandos who couldn't quite believe they had destroyed Nazi atomic dreams with one perfectly executed raid. they had. And in doing so, they prove that sometimes the future of civilization can hang on something as simple as water, heavy water, and the determination of those brave enough to ensure it never reaches the wrong hands.